I've really been enjoying this season of The Mandalorian, so in this video, I'm going to be building one mock from each of the first 3 episodes of Season 3. And I didn't necessarily set out to do this, but each build gets bigger and better as I go, at least in my opinion, so you're going to want to stick around to the end for this one. Let's get started. For episode 1, there were a couple of fun scenes to choose from. As much as I love the opening scene from the beginning of this episode, I don't really know how I would go about building a large turtle monster, so that was out of the question from the start. Nevarro would be cool to build since it has some unique architecture, but most of my white parts are tied up in my Hoth build at the moment, so that wasn't going to be much of an option either. One thing I have plenty of though is stormtrooper helmets. So for this first build, I'm going to build the scene where Mando and Grogu arrive on Nevarro and see the statue of IG-11 standing on a bunch of stormtrooper helmets. I started with a very simple base using a 16 by 16 plate. I added a black border around the edges and tiled it off to give a simple, clean finish. The ground had a tiled pattern in the reference shots that I used for this build, so I wanted to make sure that I captured that in this build to give some interest to the ground. No crazy landscaping here though, because this is a fairly basic environment. I used a wheel piece to figure out the placement for the base of the statue. I thought this piece looked pretty similar to the base of the statue in this shot, so I figured it would work out pretty well. I attached it to the ground using a Technic axle and added some plates and a round brick on top to create a flat base so it would give me somewhere to attach the IG-11 minifigure. I also added some tile around the edges and created a ledge to hold all the helmets in place when I was ready to add them in. In this part of the episode, we see a bunch of locals walking around in the background of the shot, so I thought it'd be fun to put a few random minifigures together to add into the back half of the build. I got everything set up and this is how it turned out. I think it looks pretty good for what it is, but the surroundings feel a little boring to me. I think I captured this moment in the show pretty accurately though, so I'm happy with it, even if it looks a little basic. Let's move on to episode 2. Episode 2 had some great options for scenes to build. I have an R5 minifigure, Pelimoto, and some Jawas, so I immediately started thinking about how I could build the scene at the beginning of the episode where Pelimoto sells R5 to Mando. Even though I have all these figures, I think there were some much more exciting moments in the episode. The fight between Mando and the spider tank could have been really fun, but I already knew what my choice was going to be as soon as I finished watching this episode. The moment where Mando enters the water in the mines of Mandalore is such a cool scene, so it felt like the obvious choice to me. Again, I started this build out using some larger plates. I connected everything together with black plates and made a border using 1x plates and tiles. This is almost always my go-to method for making borders because it's so simple and it looks clean. Next, I started working on the stairs going down into the water. In a mock like this, I usually start building at the lowest elevation point and work back from there. This helps me make sure that I get all my spacing correct and I don't end up having to undo a bunch of work because I made things too tall to start with or something like that. Once I had my floor height figured out, I moved on to building these pillars that we see in between the entry and the stairs going down to the water. Thankfully, I had just the right number of slope pieces to get the angles looking good while keeping the pillars symmetrical. After that, I moved on to building the entrance to the cavern. There are some stairs leading up to the entryway and the door has some pretty distinct shaping to it, so I wanted to make sure I was able to capture that. I didn't add any details or rock work into the back wall because they're pretty plain looking in the shots that I saw and the pillars would cover the majority of it from view anyways. After finishing the back wall, it was time to get into detailing the floor of the cavern. I used a combination of tiles, plates, and ingot pieces to add texture to things. I also incorporated some dark bluish gray slopes to look like fallen rock pieces from when the Empire bombed Mandalore. The final section to add to this build was the water. I used a black plate for the front section of the build because I knew I was going to use trans blue tiles for the water. This is a dark cave, not a bright beach with clear blue water, so using black underneath those pieces gives the water a much darker look, which I think matches the scene pretty accurately. After wrapping up the building process, I added in the figures from the scene and this is how things turned out. I think this build ended up looking great. After adding in the minifigures and Mando's gear next to the steps, the whole thing comes to life and I think it would be pretty recognizable to anybody who's seen the show. If you're enjoying this video so far, take a second and consider subscribing. It's free and it helps me keep making videos just like this one because it lets YouTube know that you're enjoying it. Let's get back to it. Alright, so episode 3. This one was a little tough. I sat here for an hour and a half the other night looking through this episode, and I was struggling so hard to find something that I wanted to build. We don't have any minifigures that have been made for Pershing, and to be honest, I wasn't really all that interested in making a build based on him anyways. I started looking at the ending of the episode and considered making the beach where Paz Vizsla and the other Mandalorians come out to meet everybody as they arrived at their hideout. This seems like a doable build, but it really didn't excite me because it would have been a pretty basic terrain work style build and it wouldn't have been much of a challenge. I continued looking at different shots and found myself back at the beginning of the episode. I loved the fight between the TIE Interceptors, Bo-Katan, and Mando, but building that wouldn't make too much sense. I kept watching and then got to the part where the TIE bombers took out Bo-Katan's castle, and then it hit me. I should build the castle in micro scale. But I've never built anything in micro scale, and that castle has a lot of tough angles to work with. But I said I wanted a challenge, so here we go. To set the scale for this build, I started with putting together a micro scale and one starfighter. I'll put a link to the Rebrickable page for this in the description in case you want to build it for yourself. After building the starfighter, I began building the landing platform for it to sit on, and I worked my way back from there. I tried a few things to get the steps looking right for the transition into a walkway leading up to the castle. I used snot building techniques, and then I laid out a bunch of plates on top of bricks so I could attach tiles and other decorative elements on the top side of the platform. I moved on to building the support structure under the front side of the platform and had to start thinking about how I was going to attach this to a mountainside. It was also at this point that I realized I'm also going to have to build the mountainside so this doesn't look weird sitting all by itself. I kept building, working on extending the platform back further and further away from the landing pad. There was also a pattern of support beams on both sides of the platforms that I built using a combination of regular and inverted slope pieces to copy the angles from my reference photos. Next, I moved on to building a base for the build, and I started adding a ton of rock work around the bottom of the structure to get it to look like a cross section of a mountain. I probably should have started with this because I kept having to take the platform off and put it back on to fit the slopes in on the underside. On the other hand, it was nice to have the structure relatively complete already so I could get everything to look natural when choosing what angles to take with the rock walls. Now that I was finished with the rock work, it was time to move on to detailing the castle entrance and constructing the front facade of the building. I built the front walls of the main building and placed them at an angle. I put up a large wall in the back using dark bluish gray so that it didn't look strange when you looked through the front gaps of the building. Next, I moved on to building the roof and attaching it to the top of the building at an angle. Finally, I built all of the structures we see on the walkway leading up to the building, as well as a few other decorative elements. After finishing this up, I wasn't really all that happy with the final result of the main building and the angles I used, so I rebuilt that section, and this is how it all turned out. This is definitely my favorite build of the three, and I think it looks great for the scale it's built in and all the detail I was able to include. I'll probably be holding on to this one for a little bit instead of instantly parting it out like I normally do. This was a fun challenge, and it pushed me outside of my comfort zone, which is a good thing at the end of the day because that's what helps me become a better builder. If you want to see more videos like this one, make sure you hit the like button so I know you enjoyed it. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and I hope you have a good one.